please do me a favor and just rate the show, whatever app it is that you're using, Apple Music, Spotify, I don't know, the 11 other platforms I have this on. If you have a chance, leave a review too. That helps me out so much. And this call is really informative. It's about a guy who lived in North Korea for 2 years. For those who don't know, North Korea has a very strict regime, and there are barely any outsiders let into the country. And this guy had an exclusive look at that. So yeah, go ahead and enjoy.
Yo, Jack Flex, answer the fucking phone, dude.
Hello.
Jack.
You had lived in North Korea for 2 years, right?
Yeah, 2.5, not quite 3 years.
Especially just understanding what's going on in North Korea, I could definitely tell right off the bat that there's probably a lot to take away from that and from your experiences there. I guess the first thing that I'm kind of wondering is how did you manage to get into North Korea for that period of time in the first place?
My relative, I can say he was my grandfather. When I was 15, he was appointed to go work for the embassy of our country in North Korea for about 4 years or so. And I didn't really have a choice in the matter, seeing as I was just a teenager. It's a decision that was made between him and my parents. And so off I went to join him there. Supposed to be there for longer, for the full 4-year term that he had, but combination of me being mentally affected and physically affected later on, and then also them wanting to make sure I actually went to the proper university and all that. Cut the time short, but we're from a country that's sort of neutral. Maybe not. We're not considered an enemy by them. Our country's official stance is that we don't consider them to be an enemy or anything like that. So.
Or what age were you when you first stepped foot into North Korea?
15. So I was there from 15 to 17.
So you're there from 15 to 17. So did you really realize the gravity and the weight of being able to step foot into North Korea at the time?
Well, yeah. So previously, I had lived in the U.S. and in Japan, so it wasn't like I was going from my home country straight to North Korea. Japan and America are, two of the countries that North Korea's government doesn't like, and it's vice versa. They consider North Korea as a rogue state, right? So I kind of had a feeling it was going to be pretty rough. My family had also told me, they're a communist country. Our country used to be communist back in the day, and I used to hear all the horror stories from back in those days, right? So I fully expected it to be bad, but obviously I didn't have a choice in the matter, so.
So your headspace going into this is that, you were young, you were fully, I mean, it seems as though you were more or less, you had a very good picture of what, you were stepping into. Were you scared, nervous?
Well, there was a little bit of, both, also a little bit of excitement too, in a way, because not something that people can experience all the time, right? Pretty rare experience. So there was a bit of excitement too. And, there was also a little bit of, happiness just that being able to, see my grandparents again, right? Honestly, the feeling of being scared or being nervous about going there, I kind of tried to bury it because, like I said, I didn't have a choice. It's like, so I just basically kind of tried to take my mind off of those feelings.
Oftentimes when you enter a new area, of course, of culture shock. So, once you kind of step into North Korea, maybe you land, you're leaving the airport, taking a look around, what are some things that are starting to stick out to you immediately?
Oh, even before leaving the airport, as soon as we left the airplane, there's just so much grandiose propaganda everywhere, giant big bold lettering. Of course, I didn't understand Korean at the time. Hell, it was propaganda, just because kind of what I was expecting. And then there's like pictures of the leaders. People dressed like, how Soviet people used to dress back in the day, right? Like almost looking kind of militaristic in a way. And then, we started the drive into Pyongyang. Yeah, it's more and more propaganda. Like, the closer we got to the city center, more and more there was. So much propaganda and, those murals, with like I'm sure you can, find examples of them, like Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il, because Kim Jong-un wasn't around then. It was still Kim Jong-il's regime because he hadn't died yet. But, like him, like just kind of like holding his hand out above like fields of wheat with like the workers, like kind of like worshiping him, right? Stuff like that you would, kind of see in foreign media. But like, in person, and, there's like all these like flowers, stuff like that to offer up to the monuments, right? And then, there were also the infamous traffic police, instead of traffic lights, they had the policewomen in uniform, directing traffic. But, when there's like literally almost no other cars, it's pretty interesting.
This is like so much. You just described to me so much. That's a lot to take in like any general area. Like all this, like you said, it's just propaganda all around you. And once you're taking a look at this in person, because it's one thing to see it through maybe a couple pictures here and there, and there's another thing to see it in person. Did you get like impending sense of like doom, or did you get an impending sense of like, oh God, like I'm really here right now in that moment?
So it didn't really set in until like, later. So, I had my grandfather and his family there, picking us up from the airport, and I felt at ease, so to speak, initially. And then, like you realize internet access is limited, and there's certain things you can and can't bring into the country, and so on and so forth. Like, more I was limited, the harder it got, because then I really started understanding what living under censorship and surveillance really meant, right? But that took some time to set in. It wasn't initial on that very first day, no.
Can you describe to me a little bit about your living arrangement at that point in time?
I lived at the embassy, in the embassy compound, and all the embassies are, in like a special area. There's a couple different areas. I mean, the Russians and the Chinese got their own little area, but like everyone else got like these two little districts in Pyongyang where all the embassies and international organization buildings were. Living in a regular old house, just happens to be in the middle of Pyongyang.
You had already brought up that you realized that you were going to be living under censorship and constant surveillance, but it took a while to set in, if that makes sense. So, I believe right now you live in a different country, I believe.
Oh, I live in the U.S. now.
I've lived in the U.S. my whole life, so I can't really particularly imagine that level of surveillance and censorship. What are some things that you can just think off the top of the bat of your head that you can just do in the U.S., no problem, that would get you in huge trouble in North Korea?
Wouldn't get me in trouble, not necessarily, but the embassies all had these little guard booths at the gate, and they were manned by North Korean guards, soldiers, right? And had little like hotline style telephones, the kind that doesn't have like a dialer. And whenever we would leave the embassy premises or the gate, and whenever we would come back, they would always pick up the phone and report that we were leaving or that we were coming back in, right? That was like the very first thing that I noticed, because as soon as we got to the embassy, I saw the guard there, and I was like, oh hey, look, it's a North Korean soldier who's the guard. Okay, didn't expect that. And then, he picked up the phone, and then, one of the embassy staff, they told me, oh yeah, every time you come in and leave or, whatever, they'll always pick up the phone to report it. And I was like, oh, okay. And then, but yeah, like, like here, like if I was leaving my apartment or like, anywhere really, like, you don't ever get that, right? And, we assumed that there were always like, people planted around the city and those, embassy compounds that, reported on our whereabouts. Right? Can't say I've ever had that kind of experience anywhere else I lived. And then something that would get me into trouble, I could just drive around the city, here where I live, for no reason to go anywhere, right? But back then, if we went somewhere we weren't supposed to go, there would obviously be guards or like a car that would just like stop us and tell us to, like get out of there, right? I mean, unless I'm like overtly like, trespassing somewhere, right? Like here in the U.S., don't think anyone would tell us to leave a certain area for no reason, right? But that happened quite often because we would go exploring around the city and end up in places we shouldn't be at. Walking around the city or taking a bike ride or going for a drive could get you in trouble if you didn't know where you were going, or if you weren't sure if where you were going was, somewhere that you were allowed to be at.
That's a significant difference. And you had said that you were 15 to 17 during the time of your residency?
Yeah, so, towards the end, I learned how to drive, so I was sometimes driving around the city too.
Were you going to school there at that point in time?
Yes, so Pyongyang has something called the Pyongyang Foreigner School, and it was a school specifically meant for foreign children, who were there under similar circumstances as myself, or the exact same circumstances, I guess, for most of them.
When you were going to this location, did you ever have discussions with your peers about the general state of where you guys were living in North Korea?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much every single one of us hated it, like slow internet, or like internet with censorship. You know how they talk about the Great Firewall of China, right? It's the same thing. We can't just access any website we want to. Constantly have to use a VPN, but the internet was slow to begin with, and then on top of that, using a VPN would make it even slower. And then, just not being able to go down to the corner store to pick up a new game. Like, we would have to drive all the way to China for that, or like have someone bring it to us or whatever. So, there was constant boredom, and, we would basically trash talk the whole regime just for having us be bored. Like, how dare they, right? And then, there's a lot of underage drinking because there wasn't a whole lot else to do. We were bored out of our minds with not much else to do, so we would, to drink a lot. And the funny thing is that the diplomatic clubs, or that's just like a fancy term that they used for places where we could go, basically, for entertainment. They had like restaurants and like stuff in there. Like, they knew we were underage, but they would still serve us. It's pretty hilarious.
Did you ever get to talk to anybody outside of this educational institution? Somebody that was not a part of like this diplomat community, just a regular citizen?
Not so much. So my actual contact with North Koreans was pretty much limited to teachers at the school, my tutors, and like restaurant and shop staff, or like people at the market, like the people like manning the stalls, right? We knew better than to just like strike up a random conversation with a random North Korean. That probably wouldn't be good for them. And on top of that, they probably knew better than to just randomly talk to us too. However, every once in a while, though, maybe people got to like really curious and just couldn't help themselves. But there would be people who would come up to us and like ask us for the time, like if one of us was wearing a wristwatch or something. But that's about it for like the general population.
I guess there was it's almost like a clear divide between this diplomat community and like the regular community of North Korea, if that makes sense.
That's a very clear divide. I mean, we would obviously be able to go out into the city, but we wouldn't really have the chance to just interact with random people.
How does that work that you don't want to, or that you can't talk to them? Like, if you were to talk to them, would they just kind of brush you off?
First and foremost, like they obviously don't speak English, right? We could approach them with our broken Korean, right? Yeah, like there was a few times where we tried to just kind of like, ask for directions, right? Like we didn't need directions, but just to make it look like, we were just asking for directions, and they would just kind of like wave us off and just like keep walking, or no one would actually like stop to talk to us.
How would you describe the infrastructure and the general appearance of North Korea in these cities?
Pyongyang, the capital city, is very different from the rest of the country. So I could start off with North Korea and then just kind of do it in two parts, I guess. So Pyongyang looks a lot like any other country that had the Soviet style, architecture. Of course, aside from the propaganda pieces, like the apartment building blocks look like stuff from my home country, where back in the day we used to be a part of like comp block, right? So it's actually pretty nostalgic in a way. Like the apartment buildings look very similar to what I grew up around, right? And then as for like other public infrastructure like roads, electricity and heat and all that, the roads were actually pretty nicely paved. There weren't like a whole lot of cars around, so I assume the roads didn't degrade that much just because it wasn't being used that much. Electricity, when I first got there in 2008, there were so many blackouts. Like even at the diplomatic district, just a constant blackouts. And then in the middle of the night, like there wouldn't be any like street lights on or any lights on at like the private homes, because of the blackouts. So like sometimes at night it's just like pitch black, like like you're in the middle of a dark forest, except for the monuments, which I guess they must have had separate generators for them or separate power lines because they were lit up 24/7, right? And then like heat. From my understanding, the general public, they didn't have like regular like heaters in their home. They had radiators, in the apartment blocks, but no, whether they were on or not, most likely they were off because it seemed like a lot of people were just burning coal, like in little stoves and just had like the pipes sticking out the apartment windows, right? So I'm assuming the heating situation was pretty bad, and it would get actually really smoky in the winter just because of everyone constantly burning coal, charcoal, to keep themselves warm. And transportation is, I guess, another one. Most people didn't have cars, obviously, and people who did have access to cars, it was because of like a job they held, like if they were like say a transportation driver for some kind of military personnel or something, right? No one really had personal cars except for like the very cream of the crop top elites, right? They'd actually have some pretty fancy cars. So most of the population would either walk or bicycle or take the bus or the subway to get to wherever they were going. Water, hot water was sometimes unavailable even during the winter, even in the diplomatic districts. So I assume it must have been much worse for the locals. Now, some of these things did improve over the couple of years that I was there. I guess electricity is the only one that noticeably improved. The blackouts were less common, and seemed like a lot more people were actually able to use electricity even at night compared to when I first got there. So I suppose that's it for the infrastructure in the city. Now, outside the city, there's like varying conditions, but like some of the worst I've seen, which was most of the rest of North Korea, like the homes are like just literally like mud brick housing, brick sheds, if that makes sense. I heard some of them didn't even have like proper floors. It was just like padded dirt, right? It's like straw on top, literally like old school farm living conditions, I guess. Yeah, like for them, like electricity was rationed in the countryside in most places. Access to running water wasn't even available in many places. I personally saw people like, just like how like some people used to do, back in the day in my country, like they would, go to like water wells or water pipes and like they'll have to like, fill up like big water jugs and carry it home for use, right? Like they didn't have running water at home. Between Pyongyang, the capital city, and the rest of North Korea, very big clear divide. Now there were like some like bigger population centers, right, that had it a little bit better, but those rural communities, man, it was pretty bad.
Did you ever feel almost not guilty, but did you ever feel just shocked or bad almost every time you went out noticing these things?
I had a lot of like misappropriated or misallocated guilt. I had a hard time, even though food was plentifully available to us at the embassy, right? Like I had a hard time like just like keeping it down because of all the people who are obviously suffering from hunger, like out in the countryside especially. And there's all these reports that say millions are starving and all that. Even if a fraction of that was the truth, even if it wasn't like 3 million people starving, even if it was just like 1 million people starving, like that's still pretty bad, right? And I would just have this like weird sense of guilt, like living at the embassy, nice and cozy, with access to heat and electricity and at least cold water, like almost all the time. And yeah, it was weird. Like obviously it wasn't anything under my control, right? I couldn't fix it. I wasn't the one responsible for it, but I definitely felt this weird sense of guilt. And yeah, like it even led to an eating disorder. So yeah, I guess the short answer is yes.
How did you manage to relocate or pacify that feeling?
Well, like I said earlier, there was a lot of, underage drinking, right? That us teenagers got up to. Also, when I was in North Korea, that was the first time I did like drugs recreationally. something called amidol, which is kind of like methadone here in the U.S., right? Opioid substitution. Take it at large quantities, gives you a high, right? And then video games, reading, like binge watching TV shows, just anything to try to take our minds off of it, I guess.
What do you think was the most life-altering thing you might have seen while you were spending time in North Korea?
I grew up pretty spoiled, like in a pretty cushy environment because of my family, right? The country I'm from, we're not a first world country by any means, but, I had the opportunity to travel. I had, I always had food, right? And, we had like imported goods, so on and so forth, access to good education, right? I was always aware that that was something that wasn't normal for every single human being, right? But especially seeing the countryside, how things were in rural North Korea, it was just like in my face. I became keenly aware of hunger problems, not just in North Korea, but like around the world, and it really kind of quote unquote brought me down to earth, so to speak, right? Just the privilege of having like not even 3 meals, but 2 meals a day, right? Was just this amazing thing, right? Like something I took for granted. Yeah, I guess just witnessing the hunger and just lack of, like basic goods and services we have and we take for granted, put everything into perspective, I guess.
I also would like to add in here too, this is something that was on my mind as we were speaking earlier, is that you were talking about having the opportunity to see these problems right in front of your face, and how you're aware of how lucky your upbringing was. And I certainly can agree with that because I was raised in the United States. I was lucky enough to say that I never had any issues growing up in terms of having these basic necessities, really. Not at one point throughout my entire life. And I never have known the pain of hunger in that sense. Well, aside from fasting, that's a completely different thing, and that's a choice that you make, which makes it completely different. But I've never had a loss of water or housing ever at any point in my life. Not even just with North Korea, but with the world at large. You can notice areas and parts of the globe that are not doing well by any way, shape, or form or means, and the people that are inside of these countries, whether it be North Korea, I believe even Pakistan right now with the flooding, and many others, you can notice huge disparities of tragedy overall throughout the globe. It's not even having seen it with my own eyes and just seeing pictures. I do feel like I'm somewhat aware, but I'm also 100% aware that seeing it in person must have, I think, rearranged the bricks to your reality, if that makes sense. Because
yeah, absolutely. My perception changed forever. And, to take this, like silver spoon spoiled kid and, like have him like understand so much in just one visit outside of Pyongyang, I feel like that's something that, otherwise might have taken me years and years and years to realize, or maybe I might have spent the rest of my life not even realizing how privileged I was, right? Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely, life altering, like world changing. Thing is, it's not even that the world actually changed; it's just my perception of it. If that makes sense.
how do you, with this new perspective that you have, how do you make peace with that?
Well, I personally try to donate as much as I can to the local food bank. Here in the U.S., this isn't to like say, oh yeah, the U.S. is as bad as North Korea. I hate it when people do that, but there are still hunger problems, right? It may not be as extreme as some parts of the world, but it does exist, and unfortunately, there's nothing I can do personally for the people of North Korea or really any other country, right? Just one person, but try to volunteer. I try to donate. That's the extent of what I can do, and I know there's many different things I could have focused on, but I just personally really felt like hunger was the one I chose, just because seeing the people like who are scrawny and like you look at the average height in North Korea and the average height in South Korea, like these were the same people at one point, right? They come from the same root. They're both Koreans, right? But the people have just been so malnourished for 2-3 generations now, to the point where they're just much smaller, right? And I don't mean just like in stature, but I don't mean just like in general stature, but like their shoulder width, even their gait small. It's hard to describe, but you can definitely tell that there was like lingering effects that generational starvation has had on these people, right? And remembering the people like begging for like not money or other things, just for food, and including children, right? Reminded of how like you know obviously malnourished they looked. Like that's just an imagery I can't get out of my head. So whenever I'm like volunteering or donating to like food banks, that's usually what I keep in mind. I personally, I don't know that I'll ever be able to make like complete 100% peace with it, but I just try to do what I can for the local community, and that's pretty much. I've come to accept that that's the best I can do, if that makes sense.
And that's also another interesting thing, right? Your limitations of just being one person, because you witness something that's so that just bends your reality so much. But you're literally only one person, and you can only do so much. And what you're doing seems to be absolutely perfect, which is just helping out your local community, which is something that I try to, or especially throughout high school and up until now, I've tried to do with volunteering and whatnot, to just help out your general area, because your general area gives to you and you give back to it, if that makes sense. So we talk so much about how this has changed how you view everything. What do you make of people who visit North Korea and just come back and say everything's fine?
Oh God. So, yeah, that's it's a special pet peeve of mine. I mean, so it's already we've established that Pyongyang and the rest of the country are very very different, right? And not just that, but like those tourists, they are on a very custom tailored tour, right? That's state approved. And on top of that, they're paying that regime to go there too, right? They're the people that created the whole mess in the first place, right? And that benefit from it, right? And then they will see all these wonderful things, and then especially the ones who are like online communists, they will use those like tourist statements and pictures and videos as justification to say that hey, there's actually no problems in North Korea. And I can tell you with like 100%, like no doubt in my mind, that these people are just quite literally falling for it. They are taking in the propaganda and becoming one with it, and then now propagating it, right? Spreading it even further. I would really urge these people to reconsider. Now, you can say that parts of Pyongyang are cool. You can say that parts of Pyongyang are nice and clean, whatever, right? You can say that parts of Pyongyang are whatever, like whatever good adjective you want to use, right? But please don't use that one very small, like highly supervised and censored tour to describe this whole country, because there's a whole lot that's happening that the regime doesn't want people to know about. Don't be blind to the rest of the country. I guess is what I would say to them if I can.
Does their reaction that you said, in the sense of them falling for it, does that make you angry or does it make you sad?
I mean, both. Obviously, I've kind of dealt with it, so I'm less angry and more sad nowadays. But initially, especially like because I spent years trying to get myself in the to be able to talk about it without going down like a depression spiral, right? When I found out that these people exist and watched some of their videos, and they're claiming, oh yeah, there's no problems in North Korea, and it made me sick at the time, because not only were they just, like kind of denying the existence of my personal suffering with it, they're also denying and just kind of like wiping from existence the literal starving millions and the generations of people who've suffered, not just like, hunger and lack of water, but ultimately death and cannibalism even at some point, right? When they say these things, right, maybe they don't really get the full implication, right? Because one person spreads it to another and then to another and to another, and then the wrong people use that as ammo, right, in discussions. And it's all it does really at the end of the day is to silence the suffering that all these millions of people now and in the past have suffered. Again, that made me really, really angry when I was younger. But now it just mostly makes me sad. But as you can tell right now, like if I actually spend some time talking about it, a little bit of that anger is reignited.
No, I could definitely feel you getting, I would say, more passionate about the subject more than anything else, rightfully. You had brought up this concept of generational suffering just earlier, and the Eastern philosopher Confucius often talked about the way, and the way was keeping up traditions, having a good set of morals, and being an all-around gentleman in order to live a good life. I find that in these states that have absolute control over their citizens, tradition kind of tends to die, or religion kind of tends to be a little bit less prominent in the country. Would you say that about North Korea?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, technically, religion isn't banned there, but that doesn't mean there's also a lot of people practicing religion openly, right? But like the cult of personality that the leaders have and the leaders' backers have around them is insane. Like, for example, if you look up Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, right, his like funeral procession, you have people throwing their coats in front of his funeral wagon, like in the middle of winter, so that he won't get stuck in the ice. Insane stuff like that, right? Like, it's come to the point where that in and of itself is a religion, right? And like whenever, like the leaders, like go out in public or do those tours or whatever, and they have like crowds of people like falling on their knees and like kind of wailing, right?
Wow.
But in happiness just because they were able to see him. Like, that's how I would expect Western Christians to react if, they saw Jesus, right? Like, that's the kind of vibe I get from them. So yeah, the old traditions that I've seen in my home country and in China, Korea, Japan are almost non-existent, and it's substituted by this, weird, I guess, deification, right, of the leader and his family, right? I mean, they do have some old temples and stuff that they still preserve just for like historical relevancy or whatever, for tourists. To show them, hey, yeah, we have religious buildings, so how can we be against religion? But you don't see people openly actually exercising it there, right? Exercising religion there. Like, they don't actually worship in public. And unfortunately, the people who are actually like devout, whether they're Buddhist or Christian or whatever other tradition they want to like uphold, whatever other religion they want to practice, they have to do it kind of underground, not like literally underground, but like in hiding, right? And in fact, I cannot for the life of me remember his name, but there was even a tourist who was arrested and held in North Korea for a short amount of time because he left a Bible in sort of like a club, like a leisure spot, right? It's arguable whether he did that on purpose or not, but like he was arrested and held there just for having left the Bible in public. So like there's obviously a lot of censorship like surrounding religion, right? Like, they claim that they have religious freedom, but that's just a claim, right? Just another piece of propaganda to make themselves look better. In practice, in effect, it's like it's banned, right? Religious people are prosecuted because in the past, some dissidents were tied to religious groups. Just because of that, the rest of the other people who just maybe want to read the Bible or practice Buddhism or have to suffer for it. Yeah, the traditions, really, like, I myself, coming from a very traditional family who really likes to uphold old traditions, like Eastern Asians, right? It's almost non-existent. Like, I really didn't see much.
You were talking about people and how they would go crazy seeing these leaders. I had asked you earlier about if you ever got the chance to talk a lot with the general population of North Korea, and it seemed as though you hadn't. But maybe from your peers or from somebody else, were you ever able to gauge how these people generally felt about their situation?
I actually got to be pretty close with a few of my tutors and a couple of the restaurant staff people, right? Because they're serving you drinks and you're just sitting there, right? Sometimes just talk a little bit. It wasn't like a friendship, right? But I did get to pick their brain a little bit here and there. And over the course of a couple of years, that does come up to be a decent amount of information. So from what I could see, there were a few different patterns. You could tell some people really, truly, fervently believed in it, right? Like a fanatic, right? They really did believe in it. But then you could tell some people who were just, saying what they were supposed to say without the passion behind it, right? Whenever I ask about the leader or the party or what the government or their quote unquote history with Kim Il Sung, and so yeah, like, you got some people who truly believe it, some people who just say what they're supposed to say, but you can kind of tell, and they almost imply that they are not really, that the heart's not really in it. And then there were some people who straight up just said, hey, like, I know what you're getting at. I don't want to talk about this because as long as I'm not leaving, there's no point behind discussing it, right? Like these are the more jaded people, like who are a little bit more, who aren't as open to the propaganda, right? But it's ultimately to them, it's like talking about it holds no purpose other than just getting them in trouble, right? Because like they said, if they can't just up and leave, like what's the use in complaining about it, right? That was that's about as much that's about as close as I got to someone openly talking against the government or the leader or the party or the propaganda.
But it seems like a generally, for the most part, like a defeated or quieted attitude.
Yeah, the I would say that was the largest number of them. Like for example, like hospital nurses, doctors, teachers, tutors, staff. Like generally, they would just kind of like, they're kind of going through the motions, and then every once in a while you'd have someone who's like just a fervent believer, and you could tell because they got this like insane passion, and they're tearing up as they talk about the leader and the history and so on and so forth. But yeah, that was definitely not the majority. The majority were, yeah, like you said, defeated and quiet.
Do you think that the West accurately depicts how North Korea goes about putting up this propaganda?
Does the West have an accurate picture of them?
Yeah, like do you think that the West, particularly the United States and the Western Hemisphere of the world, do you think that they have a good, accurate depiction of North Korea overall?
Well, so what I would say is yes to a limited extent. So, like sometimes you'll have some people who exaggerated a bit too far, right? And some of these people are just regular people and some of these people work in the media, right? And, as a lot of people can agree, there is information manipulation on both sides. However, I will say that the depiction of North Korea as, put out by the West, right, is probably a lot more accurate of the realities than like what's put out by North Korea. So just because there's information manipulation on both sides doesn't mean that like, oh yeah, like, the US must be absolutely full of BS. Like that's not it. Like let's say if it was like a sliding scale, I would put it at like 97%, like in favor of the US image than compared to what North Korea puts out, because they put out this image of North Korea being like a paradise, right? And it absolutely isn't. I mean, for a select few in Pyongyang, it might be, yes, but not for the entire population. And moving on from that, though, like because I did live in like South Korea and Japan for some time, and their image of North Korea is probably worse, I would say, compared to the West. Like they probably have the most exaggerations, I would say. But that's also probably because maybe, it hits closer to home to them, maybe. I don't know. And they have a lot more, they have a longer historical path to the whole thing. Like Japan used to be, the colonizers, and then, they had people kidnapped pretty recently. I think even as recent as the 1990s, I believe. I would say the Western depiction is at least a little bit better than what South Korea and Japan puts out.
Depiction that North Korea has of other countries and of the West.
The propaganda kind of leans into the fact that they're different, at least nowadays. Like back in the day, they used to say, "Oh yeah, we're not that different." Like back in the Cold War days. These days, they lean into the fact that they're unique, and they put a spin on it, saying like we're the last like hope for having equality for the worker and stuff like that. Saying like, oh, we're the last true communist country in the world, and everyone else has been corrupted by capitalists, namely the U.S. Right? They basically will like cherry pick things from the outside world and show it to their people and say, hey, look, see, this is why we're better and the others are worse. Like, for example, like they'll take, like homosexuality being more like socially accepted, right, around the world. And they'll put a spin on it saying, oh, this is the capitalists feminizing the world, how they're going to take over everyone once everyone's like women. But we got to stay strong. We got to hold up these gender roles, whatever, right? So on and so forth. And then to support that argument, they will like show like pictures of like South Korean and Japanese like boy band people. And yeah, like, they look effeminate, but that's like, that's their personal choice to be that way, right? It's not like someone is like injecting them with female hormones to make them that way, as the North Koreans would just. And then they'll show like warfare, like constant warfare from around the world, and they'll just blame it on the U.S. usually, right? Depending on which conflict you're looking at, they may be right on that, on a few of them, but still, like, they will claim that, that the American imperialists are, like, to this day forcing proxy wars, and, like, even as recent as, like, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, right? They blame it all on the U.S. Like, like, forget NATO, forget Russia. It's all just the U.S. playing both sides. And, it kind of ties into some conspiracy theories you can, like, find online. Not a fan of them, but some of the propaganda they put out regarding foreign countries is really just like something you would read on like a conspiracy theory forum here in the U.S. Making the frogs gay, like that kind of argument. Basically, they're making the world gay. That's, right.
It's really interesting to me how they cherry pick this information and the way that they spin it. It's as though they're just so good at just picking like the perfect pieces of information to just feed and let it work for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, because I assume like that, the people that are doing this, I assume they have a pretty good understanding of, like, of everything, both the outside and the inside, and the mentality of the people on the inside. Like, you don't get to run a regime like this by being dumb, right? So they do have some very intelligent but very sick people working for them.
And speaking of this regime, you're talking about the guards, and just how much control they have over where it is that you can go. But would you say that it truly is that militarized, generally speaking?
Well, yeah. So the conscription age for most males is 14 or to get conscripted at a pretty young age. By then they consider compulsory education to be over, right? Unless you have like some kind of path into university or further studies, or unless you have like a certain trade or something, you're basically a military grunt. And for 10 years, right? So 14 to 24 or 15 to 25, right? And women are also conscripted to a certain extent. It's not like men where it's like almost universal, right? And their term is shorter, and it's a bit more fluid than how it is for the men. Obviously, I'm not going to speak to their military power because what they have is outdated. Their training is not for most of the military not that great. But just in terms of like just personnel, the number of people they have, at any given time who's militarily trained, and it's like in active service, right? Is just staggering. It's a very large number. I don't know the exact number. I'm sure one could look it up. Yeah, it is highly militarized, and they hold parades, every once in a while where they will show off their military equipment. Mostly like Soviet and the old Soviet stuff, I should say. But they are very militaristic, and they're very proud of it. In fact, one of their government principles. So there's something called the Juche principle that their government follows, which is that they will, uphold their independence without any foreign assistance, which quite ironic, because you get a lot of foreign assistance, just food assistance usually, a lot. But anyways, in order to do that, they have another principle called Songun, and it literally stands for prioritizing the military, right? So above anything and everything, above infrastructure, social welfare, anything at all, they will 100% prioritize military advancements before they do anything else in order to maintain their independence, is what they say, right? Quite literally, the government's number one priority is the military. So it is highly militarized. However, would these conscripts actually put up a good fight with high morale? That's disputable. And, people who are a lot smarter than me have debated that topic back and forth for years, for decades, right? So, yeah, I can't have a final answer on it. But yes, it is very, very militarized. And they're very proud of it.
And I know you were part of like this diplomat community, if that makes sense. So you had received immunity from a lot of things, I believe. Was there ever a point in time where that diplomatic immunity actually saved you from any type of issue?
So I don't really know, because in the end, nothing really happened. But, every once in a while, the embassy would receive like a sternly worded letter saying, hey, like, you better watch some of these kids, they're going in places where they shouldn't be, right? Or like, hey, like they rode the subway at, and they went to like a station that they weren't allowed to go to, or like, hey, they were like driving around at like weird hours of the night, like, please, tell them not to do that and stuff like that. And, the worst that could happen to us was get deported, they can't just grab us and snatch us like they did with some people, because because of that immunity. So I assume things could have gotten a lot worse if I didn't have immunity on a number of different occasions where I just accidentally trespassed, right? Or, you know, in the case of the subway station where I shouldn't have gone to, like, that definitely would have gotten me in big trouble. But, in the end, nothing really happened, just like a warning to the embassy, so got yelled at by my grandpa, and that's about it.
I think that one thing that captured my attention quite a bit about North Korea was some of the stories of the prison camps. Did you ever get any type of experience or information regarding that? And if not, what's your general opinion on it?
So the prison camps, that's something that's very, very hard to, actually get accurate information on. Not just, for diplomatic community, but even for the North Koreans, because it turned out they don't really keep very good track of who's in and the numbers, whatever, right? Because if you kept very good track, that's, just like asking for it to be used against them, right? So they don't even know the exact number of, how many people are actually in the camp. So, the stories of those people who escaped from the camps, right? That's like
Yes.
pretty much like the only source of information we have. And my stance on that is, say if, what they're saying is like, like 10 out of 10, like as bad as it could be, right? Even if maybe a little bit of it is exaggerated, which it could be, right? Because again, there's information manipulation on both sides, right? And they might be incentivized to maybe, like kind of dial up the dramatic factors. I personally think that that's okay, because as long as it brings attention to the crimes against humanity that's still happening to this day in North Korea, right? It's all right. And even if, let's say, it wasn't like 10 out of 10, cruelty, even if it was like a 9 or a 8 or a 7, that's still pretty bad, right? So, I generally try not to argue against them or call them out or anything like that, because I do know that those, stories, they get a lot of flack for accusations of embellishment or exaggeration, right? But again, in the end, if it brings attention to North Korea, but in a negative light, I'm okay with it. And even if they did, exaggerate a little bit, again, I'm okay with it, because hey, that's literally all these people have now, right? The stories. And on top of that, since we can't get any accurate, third party, investigations, that's the only source of information we have to go off of. Why spend all the time and effort disputing that information when we could use that effort somewhere else, right? I hope that answers the question, I guess.
And
I started rambling halfway through.
no. It's all great information, and so we talked, I think, for the majority of this phone call about how kind of bad, generally speaking, North Korea is, and of course it is. But was there ever a moment that you were in North Korea that you were happy or amazed at something?
Well, there's the Arirang Festival, the huge show that they put up. Now, obviously, I don't want it to sound like, oh yeah, just because of this one thing, the rest of the country is just fine, right? I don't want it to come across that way, but I've never seen anything like it before or after, right? It's just insane. Just the number of people and the level of coordination and just the impeccable, perfect timing of literally every single participant in it. It's breathtaking. Yeah, so that you can't deny the artistic prowess of the people, so to speak. But there's so many hours of practice that goes into it, and it's kind of half voluntary, right? You don't get to say you want to join it or not. You're voluntold to join or not. So if you're one of those performers performing there, if you're happy about it, great. But if you're not so open to doing it, that could being coerced to practice for hours and hours and hours a day on something that you don't even really want to participate in, right? That from a certain perspective might seem like torture, right? So I don't want what I said about it being breathtaking to be used as justification for that for the latter half of what I said being okay.
You seem as though you've come, generally speaking, out of this situation, and you've understood a lot about yourself. You've understood a lot about the experiences that you've seen and witnessed, and you seem as though you've made, I think we were talking earlier about how you are still working on making peace with everything, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't know that I'll ever make peace with it completely, but I've come a long way. Years ago, I wouldn't be able to talk about it without, kind of just withdrawing it into my own head and just, going down into a depressive spiral, right? And got rid of my eating disorder, right? I can eat normally now. I don't have any kind of weird sense of misallocated guilt anymore. But even then, I don't think I will 100% be okay. A couple of years ago, I was at the supermarket shopping with my wife and randomly heard some Koreans talking, in a different aisle, and just weird, panicked state where I just kind of sat down and wasn't responding to my wife. I was breathing really heavy and panicking and breaking out in a sweat. And then it took good couple of minutes to get me out of that state, according to my wife. Flashbacks, right? But the last time was a couple of years ago, so I assume I'm getting better.
And I'm very glad that you're getting better. As you've just lived this and experienced this, what advice could you give to anybody who's listening on how to live a good life with your perspective?
Well, I appreciate the small things in life because, some of those small things, there are millions of people born without it, right? We touched on hunger, right? Just the privilege of having, a stable meal or two a day, right? Knowing that when you flip the light switch, it'll turn on and that you don't have rationed electricity, right? Knowing that, with the, what do you call it? The faucet, right? The faucet
Yeah.
thing. Water is going to come out, and if you can dictate whether it be hot or cold at will, right? Just really small things, just, take for granted, turning on your computer and connecting to the internet, or having the internet in your pocket, having just public libraries that you can, go to pick out unbiased information, right? And whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, you can read stuff from your own side or the other at will without anyone telling you can't, right? Without going to prison for it, without getting questioned for it, right? Small things that feel like a lot of people have for granted, should be appreciated a little more. And on top of that, speaking from someone who was born into a position of privilege, right? Just to recognize it, to own up to it, and, hopefully try to use that for good, right? For the betterment of others that may be more, unfortunate than yourself, right? At the very least, man, just donate a can or two to the food bank, right? It doesn't cost that much, doesn't take up so much time, but it makes a big difference to, a hungry family or a kid.